sentiment right now is very, very bearish. We have a reading of 40.5%. We've had the readings in the 40s last few weeks. Percent of bulls is at the, in the 20s here, 29%, 28%. Back at the December top, November peak, the readings were in the 40s over here. Now they're in the 20s. Now the percent of bears are in the 40s. Last week it was a one-year bearish high with that 47.3 reading that we had. Now this is the week of the tariffs right here, where we had that jump, but then the tariffs were paused on Canada and Mexico. This is the week where we got the CPI, the hot CPI data. We have Powell speaking. Market gapped lower on the CPI, but then shrugged it off. This week right here, again, we got the Fed minutes. Showed the Fed is concerned about the tariffs' impact on inflation. And we also got the bad news with some of the Dow stocks, and found out the White House is floating the idea of 25% tariffs on autos, pharma, and semiconductors. So there's been a lot of negativity surrounding these things. Probably going to start hearing more about the 2017 tax cuts being extended. Also be watching what happens next week with Nvidia earnings. We have very bearish sentiment here last 3 weeks. And again, we've had a lot of choppiness. Just remember, when we bottomed out in January, we were at a reading in the 40s as well. So as we go into Nvidia earnings next week, the takeaway here is that sentiment is very bearish. The herd is very bearish as we go into Nvidia earnings next week. And as you'll see shortly, the herd is very fearful as we go into Nvidia earnings. So we just got a peak, a new all-time high on the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ, with the neutral reading turning back to fear, and with sentiment extremely bearish as we head into the Nvidia earnings. The herd is extremely bearish. Over the last 3 weeks, sentiment has been bearish surrounding concerns about tariffs leading to higher inflation. Now, another reason why I don't think the blow-off top is done is because we haven't seen the blow-off top finish with greed or extreme greed. If we just finished, a lot of people saying we've now topped and it's over, which I've been telling you, again, we've gone sideways. That buys the market more time to go higher. We didn't reach the target levels, the trend line in the weekly time frame, and the trend line, the upper boundary of the rising wedge in the daily time frame, per channel in the weekly time frame. We haven't reached those levels. It buys the market more time. We've gone sideways in a consolidation. Bitcoin's done the same thing. Did we just finish the blow-off top with only reaching neutral? We did not break above 50, which is the neutral reading here on the Fear-Greed Index. It was the Fear-Greed Index that allowed me to call the January bottom. I talked about that before it happened, and I told you it was going to be bottoming at that trend line from the 2023 low. On January 9th and 10th, I told you it was going to bottom the next week because of the divergence that was forming, and I'll show it to you in a second, on the Fear-Greed Index. So are we now going to say that we've had a top that didn't top out on greed or extreme greed? Got people telling me now, oh, no, it's done, it's over. I don't think so. Just now topped out on neutral with the blow-off top. I doubt it. Now, with the selling that we've had, Friday we've moved back from the neutral area, now back to the fear area, and again, we'll be watching what happens. But let me show you on the chart real fast here. Please support the channel with the link directly below that allows me to be able to provide you this information. If you like the charts, you like the indicators, let me know that by supporting the channel today. If you could just take a moment and partner with me, I would really, really appreciate it. I don't have any sponsors that contact me all the time. I turn them down. I don't want to sell you stuff. I just put out all the information that I look at throughout the week, and just ask that you just take a moment and do what you can to help out. If you could do that, follow the link below. It'll take you to a secured site, and you could donate any amount you want or make it a recurring donation. If you do that, I thank you. But if you could take a moment to do that, I would really, really be grateful. Thank you for your consideration for that. Later in the video, I'll be talking about Nvidia, and I'll be talking about the Nasdaq's failed breakout. Watch the video all the way through. Now, here is the Fear Greed Index with the S&P 500, and here I have the S&P in red, the Fear Greed Index is in blue. And as what I just want to point out here, again, when I was warning you on January 9th and 10th that we were going to bottom the following week, I told you that there was a trend line right below the 2023 trend line, and the gap fill. The election rally, we had that gap to fill. I told you we were likely going to complete this divergence that following week with inflation data, which is exactly what happened. And we ended up out on Monday, just ahead of the inflation data on the January 13th, and completing this divergence. So far, we've risen to new highs on the S&P 500, but we haven't seen the Fear Greed Index really get above that 50 area. So we've stalled right at that 50 area. I predicted that bottom in January because, again, when you reach these extremes, or if you get a divergence at extremes like we had here or back over here at the 2023 low, in red, S&P moved to a lower low. The Fear Greed Index got a higher low. You had the same thing here, diversions. I talked about this at great length and detail in January before we bottomed out. Now we've got this negative divergence. Now, again, it may just be we're just getting a pullback. I talked about the 4 different scenarios I'm looking at in my last video. I'll link that video at the end of this one. And I talked about the different possible L8 wave counts that could give us a more mild pullback, or maybe something greater that goes down to test a January low, or possibly even take it out. I've talked about those scenarios in that video. If you haven't watched it, you might want to watch. The RSI in the daily time frame, it looks very similar to the Fear Greed Index. And again, a divergence developed here. Saw it on the 60-minute charts. Saw it here on the daily chart. And that's giving us this sell-off right here, where we have the 2023 trend line here. That trend line that I told you on January 9th and 10th that we were going to go back and test and fill the gap back over here from the election. Fill that gap. And I told you I thought we bottomed out right there and rally going into Inauguration Day, and that was correct. Talked about these pullbacks, but look at right here, again, this trend line, and I have one of them including the low because we slightly breached it. We slightly breached the trend line, and the other one is just right at it, connecting this point to this point. But could we find a bottom here in this area and build momentum to still go higher? We do have this divergence, so there is risk of breaking the trend line and testing the January low. Addressed that in my last video. Talked about the 4 different possibilities if we're still going to go make new highs. Personally, I believe we are. So the point here is what I'm trying to say is, could we be validating a higher low? If we look at another one of my indicators here, again, we're coming back into the negative region. Do we validate a higher low surrounding this trend line, or just slightly below it if we breach it? Do we validate a higher low? We did over here, breaching this level. We validated, we had a short-term bottom right there, and then we validated a higher low. Over here we did it. We had a bottom over here in this area, and that was when we formed the 2023 trend line there in the summer of 2024. We just bounced off of it here in January of 2025. Validated a higher low. We did it over here. We validated a higher low after this sell-off right here, after the late March peak there in 2024. Bottomed, we validated a higher low. Over here we did it after we had the 2023 bottom. We pulled back to extremes, so we validated a higher low. Could we do the same thing here? Possibly. I think that's very possible. I laid out what happens if we get a bigger sell-off to go back and test the January low. What could happen if we get a more mild pullback where we don't, and that could be surrounding this trend line or just slightly below it. testing our higher low right here. I talked about coming back and testing this trend line there, and we didn't do it. Could we do it right now? So just something worth paying attention to. The S&P got a bearish reversal of conditions as far as momentum on a Friday with that push down, and we wiped out the previous rally that we had with the divergences on Wednesday. On Thursday and Friday, we wiped out the previous 5 days rally from the bounce off of our 50 period. So we're back at the 50 period. So we're back where we were right here. That's where we're at right now. I mentioned in my previous update on the S&P 500, I talked about the 4 different scenarios. Do we get a mild pullback, or do we get something deeper to go back and test the January low, moving towards it to fill the gap here, or try to take out the January low? I talked about that, where I talked about getting a test of this low right here, just above it or below it. That was the back test of the upper boundary of the bull flag. And I told you, again, back then, we could get a higher low. We did right here, at least so far, but we still may get a lower low, and I talked about that. But I addressed these different scenarios, and there are really 4 different scenarios that I'm looking at right now that I'm considering. Could we just be going back to test the rising trend line in the weekly time frame, the 2023 trend line, and still try to bounce? Very possible. Do we sell off with Nvidia earnings, or do we rebound with Nvidia earnings next week? Momentum also turned bearish on NASDAQ. I pointed out that on both NASDAQ and S&P, we had a failed breakout. Here we're coming back to the 50, but we did get the red awesome oscillator bar. We'll be watching to see what happens at this trend line right here that we're approaching near a 50 period moving average. You do have a possible bearish rising wedge in the more recent price action right here. Still the possibility of a double top with the peak over here. Sometimes the second peak goes higher. I've talked about, again, that at some point we could see the S&P and NASDAQ diverge from one another. NASDAQ's had a lot of choppiness, just now making new highs. S&P already did it back in January. The NASDAQ did not. It did not make new highs. Did it here in February, but it's going to be something like this with the CPI where it was short-lived. Or is it going to be, that was not the CPI, that was the tariff sell-off where it was short-lived, or is it going to be something that drags out what we had after the December high? So we'll be watching. Momentum is shifting, though, with the S&P and NASDAQ on Friday. So we are seeing momentum. In order to go higher, we'd have to see it turn back to bullish. Just looking at the short-term momentum. VIX soared. The VIX soared by 16.28%. It's up to 18.21. The VIX soared more than 10%. It was up 16.28%. And you know what that means. Now, if you don't know what that means, I'm about to tell you what that means. And that means that the VIX, which is the volatility index, is predicting, because we had a move of greater than 10% back above the 50 period moving average, greater than 10%, that means in the next 2 trading sessions that the VIX is predicting a bounce or a bottom based on the historical closes above 10% or below 10%. A move with the close above 10% or a move with the close down below 10%. That historically data, when you get moves above a greater than 10%, a close above greater than 10%, in the next 2 trading sessions, it can produce a bounce or a bottom. Now listen carefully. Are you listening? Are you sure you're listening? We could go lower before that bottom happens. Are you listening to what I just said? Did you hear what I just said? So the VIX is saying, hey, we're going to have an update on the S&P that might be a bounce, might be a bottom, on Monday or Tuesday. That's what the VIX is telling us. When you start seeing things like the Lehman moment, 2008, when you start seeing things like the pandemic sell-off, again, where volatility just sharply soars, continues to be elevated with high percentage moves higher, then that's when it doesn't work. That's 15% of the time that it doesn't work. There are other times that it just doesn't play out. Not every indicator is not perfect. There's an 85% chance that Monday or Tuesday we will have an update. We may go lower before we get that update. It's predicting that we could get a bounce or a bottom either Monday or Tuesday based on the historical closes with the VIX. We are hitting this trend line. Again, I pointed out before that we've had the spikes in volatility. This marked the August bottom back over here. And again, volatility peaked in the S&P bottom simultaneously. Over here, we had the surge in volatility, up 74% in one day, and again marked a short-term bottom with the S&P, but the VIX topped before the S&P bottomed, and we got the bottom on the S&P at the January low, January 13th, which again I predicted on January 9th and 10th, the following week we were going to get a bottom. We did the very next session on the 13th, and again the S&P moved to a new low. The VIX had already peaked. VIX topped before the S&P bottomed. You saw the same thing over here. Again, predicted that bottom in the run-up, and again told you we are going to pull back and back test, and the S&P got a low here with the DeepSeek sell-off, and then a lower low with the tariff sell-off, but the VIX got a lower high. The VIX got a lower high, and again, the VIX once again topped before the S&P bottom. So kind of interesting. We'll be watching this trend line right here to see what becomes of that. If you break out, it could open the door for a bigger pullback. I'll be talking about that possibility. You need to watch the video all the way through if you want to know what's going on. Had the bearish MACD cross on the S&P. We got the bullish MACD cross here on the VIX. Stochastic turning up, RSI turning above 50. So we'll be watching to see if we get a larger period of volatility. But I warned you about a pullback on Wednesday. It's amazing when I warn about prices are going to pull back, and I warn about these divergences on the intraday charts. People are actually shocked when it actually happened. I warned you on Wednesday of a pullback. I also talked about the Nvidia chart, and again, how we had come up to the trend line, came up to the gap fill area, and I told you, again, we could see the NASDAQ pull back if we see Nvidia pull back at this area. About Nvidia, great length and detail earlier in the week. I did a whole video about featuring Nvidia. Talked about how it's not making new highs. NASDAQ did. Nvidia's not. We get a sell-off into the earnings next week, this coming Wednesday. Very, very possible. Talked about this earlier in the week and told you, again, good chance we're going to get a pullback off of this area, gap fill in the trend line. It's very possible that Nvidia has topped, which I've talked about at great length and detail. Let me just adjust my trend line here. We turned right off of this trend line right here, excluding the shadow here at the November peak, excluding that shadow. We turned right off that level. You're turning off a major trend line in the weekly time frame. Now, we may still try to go back up and hit this level. I thought Nvidia topped back over here, but I told you I could be wrong, and we still could go up and hit the trend line again. Longer term weekly chart, regardless of which way it plays out. Again, I think that Nvidia is likely peaked, but again, I told you I could be wrong, and even if it does, it could go up and test resistance again on into this level. This is a long-term trend line as well, not only this trend line for the more recent peaks, but I warned earlier in the week that, again, we were hitting this level, and we could see a pullback, a bigger pullback, and that could impact NASDAQ. I talked about a bigger pullback on the daily chart, and we'll look at that again in just a little bit here. I warned you we were forming divergences on the NASDAQ and the S&P on their intraday charts as we were slamming up into filling the gap on Nvidia. If I'm wrong about Nvidia peaking already, again, it could still come up into this area, still get a larger back test of this channel. And again, as I've talked about right here, is this longer term trend line going way, way back for years. Talked about that earlier in the week. Talking about these multiple point divergences that are developing here. And again, I told you I thought it peaked. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not done yet. But I do believe that Nvidia, any topping process, or as I've said many, many times, or has already peaked. A great technical damage by breaking this trend line. Right now we're stalling at that 20-week moving average as well, by the way, here. Let me just go ahead and take the time to show you this chart because we got Nvidia earnings coming up here on Wednesday, the 26th. Could this pullback with Nvidia, with the stock market, with Bitcoin, could this end surrounding the Nvidia earnings? Very possible. Here's a channel that we just looked at a moment ago, and that's from the 2022 low. That's the channel right there. If you look at this larger channel, and I've talked about this at great length and detail, and this is why I told you that I thought that Nvidia would peak. We saw it initially peak with the November earnings. Went up and challenged that high in January and just went a fraction higher, slamming up into this area once again. But again, this is all the data that we have on Nvidia, and I've drawn this channel here, and this is why I think that we're topping on Nvidia right in this area. Now, maybe we go slam into that trend line again. Maybe I'm wrong and that Nvidia didn't peak, and we go test this level again. But it's highly unlikely that we're going to be able to clear this level and be able to stay above it. Again, telling you what I think. We've already broken this trend line right here, and that could be, I talked about, validating the reversal off of this trend line, but we could still go up and slam up into that trend line in a back test of both of those trend lines, a back test of the breakdown of this channel, the smaller channel, and I should say not a back test, but another test of the upper boundary of the larger channel, a back test of the smaller channel here. But just something to be paying attention to ahead of Nvidia earnings. I want to bring this up close for you so you can see what I'm looking at. And again, if we end up getting a rally, maybe we pull back a little bit this week off of the trend line in the daily time frame, off of the gap fill area. But if we can try to rally further, again, we might get another back test of the broken trend line right here, and it's intersecting with this upper channel line, this long-term upper channel line. Here we even overthrew it just a little bit. Maybe we see something like that if we end up getting a rally with Nvidia. Just something to pay attention to. We don't have to. Nvidia, a lot of times at the end of a bull market, the leaders stop leading. That's what has happened in many, many cases in history. Not always. Times the leadership tops with the market, but a lot of times leaders stop leading. But just food for thought, something to pay attention to. But I'll be watching. Do we sell off with Nvidia earnings? We fill the gap and we hit that downward trend line and we turn off and we continue to slide, which could be problematic for the NASDAQ, as I've talked about. Or do we go up and try to get this level and slam into it one more time? The trend line I just showed you on the other weekly chart, and again, it's excluding the little shadow right here in the daily chart. If you include the shadow, then we didn't quite reach it with the January high. We still may reach it over here. But again, just an interesting trend line that intersects with this broken trend line as we move towards earnings. Something interesting to be paying attention to. Well, I told you, I thought that Nvidia peaked previously surrounding this area. I could be wrong about that. We could go up and slam up into this level and get another back test. We had a breakdown and a back test immediately, and then we had that gap lower surrounding DeepSeek sell-off. Do we back test this trend line yet again? And if we do, we can slam up into that major trend line of resistance. Just something I'm paying very, very close attention to as we move towards Nvidia earnings this next week. I talked about the NASDAQ. If we saw a bigger sell-off with Nvidia, that I told you this trend line could be tested, our cloud and our 100-period moving average. We have failed breakout. I talked about this in great length and detail in Thursday's update. But we could still try to bounce off the trend line or the moving averages and still attempt to go to new highs if we just have a pullback. Again, I told you if we broke this trend line, very problematic for the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ 100 got hit by a drop of over 2% for the Friday session, down 464 points, rounding up. I talked about this in great length and detail on Thursday. I told you we came down, we sold off to the 10-period moving averages, told you we could have a bearish hangman candlestick there and continue. If we lost a 10-period moving average and confirmed that candlestick, that candlestick's been confirmed. And again, I'm showing you the NASDAQ because I want to show you the S&P. We talked about these breakouts. And so far, we have a failed breakout on the NASDAQ. Here's a December high. And again, we had these divergences begin to form here. We pushed up to a new high earlier in the week. On this short trading week, there on Monday, we got a doji. It failed to be confirmed, closing above the December high. It failed to be confirmed on Wednesday. That's where we formed the bearish divergences On the intraday charts, it failed to be confirmed. This dotted red line right here with the close above the level for a breakout. It's a failed breakout. Doesn't mean we can't go to higher highs later, but I told you if that is a failed breakout, and if we do get a reversal, you can come back and test some moving averages. You could come back, try to fill the gap here on a closing basis, and test the cloud. We take out this low, and I talked about this gap right here, again, coming back and filling this gap, which we're now doing. But I told you to be watching this area because, again, if we did see that reversal with Nvidia off of the gap fill and off of the declining trend line, which we are now seeing, that could impact the NASDAQ 100, which we're now getting the volatility as Nvidia turns down off of that level. So, again, a failed breakout here on the NASDAQ. Back to the S&P 500. Just wanted to show you. The MACD hasn't rolled over yet. S&P got it. But the NASDAQ did not get it. The stochastic rolled over and it's now broken. It's rolled over this week and now broken the 80 level. Failed breakout here, now dropping below the 10 and the 20 period moving average. The 10 still above the 20 and the 10 and 20 are still both above the 50 period moving average. Still in a bullish arrangement. Talked about the divergences on NASDAQ and S&P, and here it is on NASDAQ. You have this bearish divergence right here. Again, these divergences, this one actually was a confirmation of lower high diverging with S&P, but the bullish divergences tipped us off to the bottom. The bearish divergence tipped us off to the bottom, the top there in December. Warned you about this divergence on Wednesday. It's now played out on Thursday and Friday. And again, we're now breaking the accelerated trend line. So the door now is open, coming back down below the 50 period, the green line right there, coming back down towards the 200, the black line right here. So the door is open to coming back now, testing the trend line here from the January low. And again, certainly a possibility. Now, again, I want to make it clear. Talked about the target levels on the weekly time frame for the NASDAQ, but I told you, again, I always tell you what I think. I'm not sure that NASDAQ is going to go up to those levels. And again, oftentimes you'll see the NASDAQ peak before the S&P 500. Very well could go up to those levels, but just going to be watching the 200 period here, going to be watching the trend line, and going to be watching the lows here. Do we get a higher low above this level right here? Do we hold above the DeepSeek sell-off here and the tariff sell-off right here? We're becoming oversold now in the RSI. We end up seeing a divergence try to form maybe ahead of the Nvidia earnings. We'll be watching that. And could Nvidia drag the market down or give it a bottom? We'll be watching to see how Nvidia unfolds next week. But it is turning off the resistance levels I warned you about earlier in the week. I've been talking about Nvidia all week. Posted some charts on Nvidia on social media as well. Now we are seeing this larger divergence from the peak over here in January here and our peak over here in our most recent price action. We're seeing a divergence, a larger divergence there on the MACD, which has now gone negative. So when it goes negative, there's risk of more downside. It's got to turn back up and go into positive territory. We're seeing this move back into the trading range on the NASDAQ after we get a failed breakout above the December high. So that's really where we're at right now. Before we talk about the failed breakout on the S&P 500, again, going back to this chart here with our failed breakout, wanted to bring up this trend line here. Again, this is what we saw on the 60-minute chart from the January low. Here it is on the daily chart. If we go below that, you get your 50 period near that level. If you go below that level, again, you got your cloud, you got your 100, and way back over here, you got your gap fill. NASDAQ, if NASDAQ manages to recover, stay out these upper channel lines still possibly in play. This is our log scaling on the weekly chart. We bounced off our 20-week moving average here at the January low, and then again after that getting another higher low. That's a level of support along with this trend line. But again, failed breakout on NASDAQ. Here is log weekly. We're still watching these multiple point divergences. Are they done? Will it drag out further here on the RSI and the MACD here in the weekly time frame? Here's our linear scaling. Didn't quite reach the peak previously over here at the December high. Do we still attempt to do that in this this upper rising resistance. So just some things I'm paying attention to here. Again, you can see we're bouncing. We bounced at the January low, and again, predicted that bounce before it happened because we were coming into that trend line on the S&P 500 in the weekly time frame. Some levels to be aware of. The trend lines are different with the linear and the log scaling, so I try to take the time to show you them. Okay. We had the Walmart earnings before the opening bell on Thursday, and that rocked the Dow. Walmart beat on earnings. They warned about profit growth slowing. Then the Dow gets hammered again today with news with United Healthcare. And then the Dow getting the largest drop we've had all year in 2025 here on United Health's sell-off on the news of a DOJ probe. United Healthcare is under investigation, which is the parent company is United Health Group. They're under investigation for their Medicare billing practices. So that rocked the Dow. Now, again, Walmart and United Health are both Dow stocks, both Dow 30 stocks. So that really rocking the Dow. Here's Walmart and United Health Group right here in the Dow 30. In my last update, I talk about the 4 possible scenarios for the S&P 500. Go watch that video. We had the sell-off. It was options expiration week. You need to keep that in mind. I'm going to be watching this trend line. I talk about the different scenarios, though, in the other video. But this trend line, going back to the 2023 low, very important on the S&P 500. S&P and all the different scenarios are featured in my last video. If you want to know what I think about the S&P, go watch that video. It's linked at the end of this video. Talked about the volatility on the Dow. The Dow, possible double top here, but got a slightly lower high from the December 4th peak. The MACD did roll over again. The Dow down 1,118 points this week, down 2.5%, just over 2.5%. Again, I've talked about Dow's already reached the upper channel. The S&P never did, but the Russell and the Dow did. Again, going to continue to be watching this level. We firmed up at the 50 level on the RSI with the Dow. We're testing the 20 period, breaching it ever so slightly now. We're still above 50 on the RSI here in the weekly time frame. We had the multiple point divergences. We got a slightly lower high. Do we still try to go up above this level for another test of the highs? Or is that all she wrote? Looking for clues. One thing I'm watching is a trend line here, the channel from the 2022 low. Okay, we turned off of that. Linear scaling, you get this trend line. We just slightly overthrew it here, going all the way back to 2018. Massive rising wedge. Okay, we've turned off that. We hit it again, turned off of that. Here's an important trend line right here, again, from 2023 that we bounced off of there at the January low. This is linear scaling going back to 2018. Just some interesting trend lines. The one I just showed you is from the 2022 low. This is going back here from the 2020 low and the 2018 high. The first high, I should say, in 2018. Looks a little different if we go with the log scaling, and I have the weekly here. This, again, from the 2020 low, trend line right here with the log scaling, and then we have the peak over here from 2021 going into 2022. Turned off of that trend line, didn't quite reach it with their second peak. Just some interesting trend lines I'm looking at on the Dow. Dow had a lot of volatility this week, so I wanted to share that with you. And we did not get a divergence between the transports and the Dow with our recent downturn this week. The Dow had turned down sharply, 2.5%, but from the peak a couple weeks ago, it didn't move to a new high above the November high. Sorry, above the December 6th high. 45,074, we were just short of reaching that level. We were under it. And again, the transports did not move to a new high. Could it be that we still end up going to a higher high on the Dow and seeing a divergence like we did back over here in 2022? The Dow moved to a new high. The transports did not. We had this larger divergence. The transports is still not moving above the 2021 high. The Dow did. So there is this larger divergence what's called the principle of confirmation in Dow theory. One of the tenets of Dow theory is the principle of confirmation, where the averages have to confirm each other. So if the Dow makes a new high, the transports have to. We don't have that here. Years later, we still don't have the transports making new highs, and sometimes they diverge from one another in the more recent price action like we had in 2021, late 2021, and early 2022. Do we see something like that here again? So again, I don't want to rule out that we don't go to a new high on the Dow. I wanted to show you some of those trend lines and let you know I'm still watching this closely and paying very close attention to it. But we had a down week for both the Dow and the transports. We got a shot at a double top here with the Dow, but again, it still could diverge with the transports and go higher up into this trend line right here and maybe reach that upper channel line, the 2022 channel that I've been showing you and showed you just a moment ago.